Good morning, everyone. Welcome to all of you present here. Welcome to our panelists, and welcome to all of those that are watching this as a webinar through the live streaming. Thank you very much to Maura Policelli for hosting our event today. I'm Laurie Nathan. I'm Professor of the Practice of Mediation and Director of the Mediation Program at the Keough Institute for International Peace Studies. The Keough Institute is located at the Keough School of Global Affairs at the University of Notre Dame. And we are organizing this event in partnership with the Peace Accords Matrix. Josefina Echeverria is here with us as the director of the Peace Accord Matrix. We are also co-hosting this with the Global Impact Management Consulting, GIMC, which is a US-based international development consulting firm. And the CEO of GIMC, Salem Hilali, is also with us today. So thank you to our partners. As the crisis in Afghanistan has evolved since the fall of the country's government in August this year, as you know, global actors have been debating how best the international community should respond to a Taliban regime, and how best the international community can assist the people of Afghanistan. And one of the things that's striking to me, and I think to many of us here, is that in this country, and certainly in many other Western countries, the experts who we see talking publicly at seminars and on television about the situation in Afghanistan are far too often, in our view, not Afghans themselves. And so we think it's important, and this is the motivation for organizing this event, we think it's important that the international response to what is happening in Afghanistan and to the Taliban regime, we think the international response needs to be shaped by the views of Afghans themselves. And really what we want to do through this event and similar events is provide a platform for Afghans and Afghan Americans to express their views. We are not looking for a consensus, and we appreciate, obviously, that there is a wide diversity of Afghan perspectives and needs. Nonetheless, we think it's important to provide platforms like this so that we have people from Afghanistan speaking for themselves. We have an excellent lineup of Afghans and Afghan Americans on our panel to address these issues today. I'm very grateful to all of them for having taken the trouble to get here, some of them under quite difficult circumstances with flight cancellations. I'm going to introduce all the panelists in one go, and after that they will make their remarks. They're welcome to come to the podium or stay seated as they prefer. Then we'll have an opportunity for audience comments, questions, I should say, not answers yet. So an opportunity for comments and questions from the audience, and then responses from each of the panelists who will make their wrap-up remarks. At the end of all of this, Salem Hilali, one of our partners, will do a kind of vote of thanks, and we'll have the final word. So our speakers are as follows. We have Ambassador Isaaqzai, who is our keynote speaker. Ghulam Isaaqzai has had a distinguished career in the United Nations and was appointed by President Ashraf Ghani as ambassador and permanent representative of the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan to the United Nations. So thank you, sir, for agreeing to speak here. Then we have Muniza Wafek, who is co-founder and president of the Afghanistan Women's Chamber of Commerce and Industry. Am I right? After she speaks, Nilufar Saki will speak to us. She is a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and a lecturer at George Washington University, and happy to also report that she's writing a book on regional dynamics, regional security dynamics relating to Afghanistan. Arif Dostia is a special friend since he is an alum of the Keough Institute. He is Consul General of Afghanistan in Los Angeles. He was previously Director General for International Relations and Regional Cooperation and Director of Peace and Reconciliation Affairs at the Office of the National Security Council of Afghanistan. Rina Amiri has dashed in from New York and has to dash back. She may have to leave a little early for childcare responsibilities, which are the highest priority of all. An old friend from the United Nations Mediation Standby Team, currently at the New York University Center on International Cooperation, and also formerly a senior advisor to the US Special Representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan. Salam Halali is the CEO for Global Impact Management Consulting. He's an international consultant professional with experience in Afghanistan, South Asia, and the Middle East, and has served in senior positions with US government-funded programs in Afghanistan and the US. I want to acknowledge also we have senior US government officials with us in the audience. Mr. Chuck Rush, who is senior advisor in the US State Department in the Office of the Coordinator for Afghan Relocation Efforts. We haven't met, so I'm not sure where he is, but welcome. And Ms. Catherine Curtis, who's a professional staff member in the House of Representatives Foreign Affairs Committee, overseeing congressional monitoring of Afghanistan. So with that, I invite the ambassador to speak to us, and we look forward to hearing his remarks.
Thank you, Nathan. Good morning to you all. Sob Bakhair to my fellow Afghans here, and also when they're listening or watching it live. Let me at the outset thank the University of Notre Dame's School of Public Affairs or Global Affairs and the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies for this invitation and opportunity to speak at this seminar. I would also like to take this opportunity to congratulate again my fellow Afghans wherever they are on the historic victory of the national cricket team. I know in the US it's not such a famous sport, but I think at these times of despair and loss, such victories are really healing words for many of us. You talked about a little bit about my career. I will start a little bit with a personal anecdote. In June this year, I was asked to represent Afghanistan at the world body, leaving 2 decades of my UN career behind. And my role was to really strengthen also the involvement of the United Nations in a post-US exit peace scenario. Some of my friends and also my family questioned my judgment and my decision against many odds. But for me, this was a call of duty and an honorable thing to do, especially for my country at the time when so many of our international partners were abandoning Afghanistan. But never did I think that I would find myself within a month 3 times in front of the Security Council, defending the rights of Afghan women and girls, and warning the Council of the grave consequences of a Taliban takeover of Afghanistan. And also, never could I imagine that the international community would so quickly abandon its partner in government or its government partner in peace and tolerate the removal of an elected government by an extremist/terrorist group. World's inaction in the face of a violent overthrow of an elected government is unprecedented in the history of international diplomacy, especially when the Taliban's action violated countless Security Council and General Assembly resolutions, which affirmed that the international community would not accept a government imposed by force and would never recognize the restoration of an Islamic emirate. While this was happening, Taliban's apologists promised the world a different and changed Taliban. However, Taliban's behavior and attitude on the ground tell a different story, a story all too familiar to many of us who experienced Taliban's rules of the 90s. The only change we are witnessing today is of a Taliban who are more violent, repressive, embedded with international terrorists and criminal networks, and sophisticated in their art of PR and deception. Since coming to power, Taliban have brutally suppressed peaceful protest, imposed gender apartheid by preventing women from work and girls from education, and have placed limits on the freedom of speech and expression. They have engaged in a frenzy of revenge killing and forced displacement of population. But ladies and gentlemen, I'm not going to delve much on the Taliban past and what they are doing now. I would like to focus on the regional implication of Taliban's rule in Afghanistan, and perhaps even global implication. I see at least 4 grave implications for the international community, which together can provide a clear strategic argument for engagement. First, and perhaps the most obvious one, is international terrorism. It was terrorism that brought the international community to Afghanistan 20 years ago, not women's rights, not a lack of press freedom. The Taliban have promised to sever their ties or relations with international terrorist groups. This was a key provision in the Doha Agreement with the United States and one of Taliban's key promises to Russia, China, and other countries. This was again reaffirmed by the Security Council in Resolution 2596 on 17 September that extended UNAMA's mandate in Afghanistan. Yet the Taliban have continued to harbor al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups and use them to unseat a democratically elected government. The most recent UN-sanctioned monitoring review report indicated that al-Qaeda was present in 15 provinces of Afghanistan. Despite these concerns, Taliban will find it difficult to sever their ties to other extremist groups. Let me give you a few reasons as to why this would be difficult for the Taliban to do. First, this will run counter to their religious belief and their identity. In reality, Taliban and all extremist groups are profoundly driven by ideology rather than by rational thinking. Second, Taliban's hardcore elements, such as the founding members and the Haqqani networks, who are in power now, have long-standing ties, including marital ties, with groups such as Al-Qaeda, Tehrik-e-Taliban in Pakistan, Lashkar-e-Taiba, Ansarullah, Jundullah, IMU, ETIM, and the list can go on, which are currently operating in Afghanistan. They help Taliban to reach power and would therefore demand reciprocity. Third, Afghan territory is notoriously difficult to control. It would be naive to think that the Taliban can prevent ISIS, Khorasan, and other terrorist groups from creating stronghold in Afghanistan when the world's best military failed to do so. US counterterrorism efforts, primarily relying on drone technology and second-hand intelligence from Pakistan, would neither be sufficient nor reliable to monitor foreign terrorist activities in Afghanistan. These are the reasons that I would believe Taliban would find it difficult, operationally difficult, to cut ties. Now let me turn to the second implication. This would arise from the risk of Afghanistan descending into a civil war that can pave the way for another cycle of proxy conflict fueled by regional rivals. Taliban's internal divisions, instability to govern, and the economic collapse will contribute to such a scenario. This war will likely have ethnic component and may therefore implicate Afghanistan neighbors. Taliban's forced displacements of the Hazaras and their inability to contain ISIS or ISK attacks against them can easily drag Iran into the wider ethnic conflict in Afghanistan. Iran is equally worried about the resurgence of Jundullah, a Sunni Baluch extremist group, which helped Taliban to capture the western cities of Herat and Nimroz. A Taliban victory in Afghanistan has already emboldened the Pakistani Taliban, widely known as TTP. As most of you know, upon capturing Kabul and Bagram, Taliban fighters released scores of TTP fighters from jail who've already crossed into Pakistan and carried out a number of terrorist attacks against Pakistani establishment. We also need to weigh the implication of an emboldened Taliban on India-Pakistan relation. The level of violence is expected to rise in Kashmir as well-trained and well-equipped and more confident Pakistani extremist group will engage the Indian Army in Jammu and Kashmir. The third implication for the international community relates to the credibility and important role of multilateral institutions such as the UN and AU in upholding international law and commitment. The international community on multiple occasions and in writing has confirmed that they would not accept a government that seized power by force or the reinstatement of the Islamic State or Islamic Emirates. Such promises were made by the General Assembly, the Security Council, and various regional fora. If the international community turns back on its word after documenting it through resolution, it would indicate the weakness of multilateral institutions and send a strong message to malicious actors all over the world. Moreover, it would normalize the seizure of power through use of violent means and terror tactics, such as suicide bombing by terrorist groups and insurgencies around the world. Our current multilateral system depends on the belief and ability of states and non-state actors to enact its promises and stand by its commitment. At a time when so much effort is being placed on strengthening the UN and global governance system, we cannot allow ourselves to sow doubt in its very foundation. Let me turn to the fourth implication for the international community, and that would be migration. Such migration would not only be driven by economic hardship and poverty, but by Taliban's draconian policies and deprivation of basic rights and freedom for all Afghans. We witnessed this scenario under the Taliban first rule of the 90s, when my own family was forced to leave Afghanistan. So if we conclude that the international community as a whole has a strategic interest to remain engaged in Afghanistan, the question emerges, what can be done by the international community, which is the main focus and theme of this seminar. Here, I would like to offer 5 recommendations and where I believe the international community can exercise some leverage. My first recommendation is to prioritize humanitarian aid and delivery of essential services, such as health, education, to prevent a total collapse of the country. As we all know, more than 18 million Afghans today depend on humanitarian aid to survive. As winter is approaching and signs of hunger and malnutrition are emerging, we need to mobilize everything at our disposal to save lives. The international community has a moral obligation to help Afghans during these desperate times. So I urge all donors and countries to continue to fund not only the United Nations, but also all other international organizations and local NGOs operating in Afghanistan, because the needs are far greater than the current funding level can address. But humanitarian aid will not be enough to prevent a total collapse of the Afghan economy. The international community must find ways to operate across the humanitarian development and peace continuum and implement the nexus in practice. While doing so, it's of course critical not to directly fund the Taliban regime or implement operational modalities that indirectly support them. In this regard, I'm pleased to note that some of the UN agencies, including UNDP, have established mechanisms to transfer cash directly to poor households without funding the Taliban regime. My second recommendation is to revive the dormant Doha peace process that began 2 years ago and work towards a sustainable peace that would address all the grievances of the Afghans and implications that I just outlined above. The situation in Afghanistan is extremely fragile, and one should not be misled by a false sense of security in the country. With Afghanistan humanitarian economic was worsening, ISK and other terrorist groups entrenching, and the Taliban's internal division and rivalries deepening, Afghanistan is headed towards a perfect storm for instability. While the Taliban have taken control of the territory, they have failed to bring peace. There are no national, regional, or global initiative, nor any international consensus to continue the peace process that began in Doha 2 years ago. All hopes are pinned on the Taliban's goodwill and empty promises to form an inclusive government. yet they have failed to engage with Afghans to create a governing structure that would provide internal decision-making mechanism and checks and balances that may prevent the most dangerous outcome, including the widespread use of Afghan territory by terrorist groups. What I propose here is a Bonn II conference, which can turn the current crisis and transition into opportunities for peace, and that could lead to a complete cessation of hostilities, launching of a national reconciliation process, and ultimately an inclusive government formed by the free will of Afghans and in which all Afghans of all backgrounds, including women, see themselves. Failing to achieve this risk turning Afghanistan into a center of destructive rivalry and a terrorist hub where proxy war continues to create regional instability. My third recommendation would be for the international community to adopt a conditional approach to recognition and engagement with the Taliban in accordance with the international commitment or the commitments made in UN resolutions, that is not to recognize the reinstatement of the Islamic State or any government imposed by force. Human rights, women's rights, girls' education, and the establishment of an inclusive government, including the participation of women at all levels of government, must be a strict red line in any negotiation between the Taliban and the international community. Fourthly, the international community must establish human rights monitoring and accountability mechanism in Afghanistan. This is called for during the Human Rights Special Session on Afghanistan. We're pleased with the decision of the Human Rights Council establishing a special rapporteur for Afghanistan, but more needs to be done to hold the Taliban and other parties accountable for past and ongoing violations of human rights. While the world is focused on humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan today, Taliban fighters are busy hunting down their opponents across the country on a daily basis. Some of you who follow Afghanistan must have seen some of the gruesome videos that are circulating on social media of Taliban fighters executing, beheading, and involved in extrajudicial killing. Fifth, the international community must fully consult and engage Afghans in all their actions and directly support civil society organizations on the ground. I think, Nathan, you alluded to this at the beginning, that you try to bring Afghans to this seminar so that they can speak for their country, and we very much appreciate it. Because many Afghans today are well-educated, passionate, and experienced. They have benefited from the opportunities provided during the past 20 years and remain determined to change the country for the better. They're your best hope for well-informed policies and to drive local and national change. Therefore, I urge the international community to continue to engage Afghans, especially women, in their consultation and fund Afghan civil society and NGOs on the ground and abroad. And finally, the international community must strive to speak with one voice and form a united position in their engagement with the Taliban. Dear participants, I would like to conclude by saying that the Afghan people are not asking for your sympathy and kind words. We ask that you understand the regional and global implication of the current situation and engage Afghans not as victims, but as stakeholders in building sustainable peace in Afghanistan. The international community has a pivotal role as a partner in Afghan struggle to protect the gains of the past. We look forward to work with you as equal partners for the benefit of Afghanistan, our region, and the entire world. Thank you.
You know, ladies and gentlemen, when we arrive at an event like this, we may not fully appreciate how much effort goes into organizing the event and how many people are involved in organizing the event. So there's this tremendous amount of thought and trouble and effort. And the point I want to make is that for this input by Ambassador alone, the trouble has been worthwhile. So thank you. This is a fantastic setting out of challenges and recommendations for us to engage in. But of course, we also have the pleasure of further panelists' inputs. And I want to turn now to Maniza Wafek. You're welcome to talk from the table or the podium as you like.
Right. Thank you very much, Nathan, and thank you, Ambassador. It was really great remarks, and especially the last one, that Afghans should not be seen as victims but stakeholders to all what international partners would like to do with Afghanistan and for Afghanistan. So with that, I would like to also preface my comments by saying that as a president of Afghanistan Women's Chamber of Commerce and Industry, which is a non-governmental and non-political organization, I have the responsibility of thousands of businesswomen in the country. And so whatever I'm saying today would all be about them. And I have considered all those responsibilities of not speaking very much politically, but more about the private sector and what can we do with the private sector. So talking about thousands of businesswomen in Afghanistan, if I give you a few statistics so you see how far we had come in the last 20 years, we have had 2,741 formal businesses run and owned in Afghanistan by women all over the country, not only in the major cities, but in all the smaller cities as well. And we have had over 54,000 informal, unlicensed businesses. So altogether, 57,000 businesses created over 130,000 jobs, plus employing themselves. And I'm not counting all the other women that they were working for them in their homes. So that would be another 30 or 40,000 women working from their homes in the villages, producing all kinds of hand-stitched and handcraft products to these businesswomen to sell in the cities and also outside Afghanistan. So altogether, we have had these businesswomen in all the sectors in the last 20 years. Sectors such as exporting, importing, manufacturing, IT, media services, construction, logistics, you just name it. So businesswomen in Afghanistan had really stepped in all non-traditional and male-dominant sectors. And they had become great role models for the next generation of young women in Afghanistan. And this was very hopeful for all of us. And so for us to really see women playing a great role in the economic health of Afghanistan, and for us to see and to plan on daily basis how to improve these businesses, how to remove barriers from their day-to-day work, and how to increase the number of these businesses in Afghanistan, all of a sudden, in just 2 weeks, we started really working on evacuation, security, and visas. So 2 weeks before August, we were working on Dubai Expo. We were planning and preparing more than 60 businesswomen to participate in Dubai Expo and present Afghan products, not only clothing and jewelry and the traditional businesses that women are running, but also dry fruits, saffron, cumin, carpet, and all the different industries that women had started their businesses in the last 20 years. So this was the level of where we were and the level of where we came to after just in those 2 weeks of August, working on visas, as I said, and evacuation, and thinking about their security and all those kind of things. And by the way, we were also planning to do 2 fashion shows in Dubai Expo, because our clothing and jewelry industries had developed and come so far that we were ready to show to the world the fashion industry of Afghanistan and the fashion industry by Afghan women. So in the last, as I talked about these figures, that shows that in the last 20 years, all the investments that all of us have had made, all the international partners and Afghans, it had paid off. And we have had women who had agency, who had respect, who had power in their societies, and so they were really part of the society on a daily basis in decision making and policy making. And so, so if I'm going to now tell you what's going on the ground, this is very obvious that whatever positive things are still there is not because Taliban has changed. It's because the Afghan people had changed. Afghan people are not Afghan people of, including women, are not people of 1990s, but they're people of 2021. So today, the private sector, as it had developed so far, we have the private schools that are open for both girls and boys from 1 to 12. In the private schools, female teachers, female, as I said, female students, they're also attending. And then we have female private universities where female students and female teachers are also attending school these days. And not only in Kabul, but in all the provinces throughout the country. And banking, telecom, factories, and all other businesses that had been there in Afghanistan, their female employees are allowed to go to their jobs. And some of the female businesses are open, such as beauty salons, and as I said, private schools that are owned by women, and private daycares, some shops that women-owned businesses were running, either in the public or some of the very closed women's markets around the country. They're open. And this shows that even if Taliban have not changed, they could have closed these, but they didn't, because they faced a new Afghanistan and a new, totally a new dynamic in that city when they came to rule it. And because of that, we also continued our engagement. We continued to get engaged with Taliban, though they have not announced any official declaration on whether women can resume and can operate businesses in the country or not. But as I said, our women businesses are operating. So we wanted to get engaged with them and get an official permission. So they, so their foot soldiers who are taking the security of the streets, they do not bother our women. And especially those women who are, as the ambassador rightly said, who had experienced last time the cruel treatment of Taliban, and because they're scared and they don't want to get out on the streets or open their shop or operate their businesses. So we wanted to really get engaged and get that official declaration from them that women businesses can operate in Afghanistan, and it's important to get that official permission for them to operate. So I wish what happened in the last 20 years in terms of development in Afghanistan and the approach to development that all of us took, I wish we had done it differently. And one of the major aspects of it that we didn't do it differently was, as Ambassador said, we were not considered stakeholders. Afghans were not considered partners. Afghans were considered beneficiaries. And because of that, whatever happened for development of Afghanistan, we couldn't build really stronger institutions and stronger communities. So with the collapse of the government, we could have seen at least better than what we see today. We could have seen. And again, the narrative of people and especially women through today's media, again, it's very different. And with that narrative, it's again going to be that approach of providing service to beneficiaries. And I would like to offer a different narrative that we are now capable of taking charge of our affairs. And so it's better to work with and through women in Afghanistan, including humanitarian aid. If we use this opportunity to firmly cement women's position in Afghanistan by delivering humanitarian aid, we will make sure that Afghan women become part of the future of Afghanistan in a much stronger way and in a much obvious way than even before. And at this moment, not only we see the need for humanitarian aid, and I would like to emphasize on the point that Ambassador mentioned, there's a tremendous need for the development as well to continue in Afghanistan and continue to all the sectors. But especially, since I'm coming from the private sector, I would emphasize on continuing supporting private sector, because Afghanistan's economy lies on the private sector's shoulders. And our private sector had taken, to some extent, responsibility, because last year our exports increased from $600 million to $1 billion. And if we continue that trend of supporting the private sector to increase export and increase and bring the balance in the payment in Afghanistan, that would help Afghanistan economy, and there will be lesser burden and responsibility for the international community to take care of Afghanistan for another 20 or 40 years to pay for our daily costs. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Maniza. Just to reinforce, I think, two messages that are coming across clearly at this stage. The first is the need for us to avoid seeing engagement as a binary, that it's a yes or no, but that rather engagement is complicated and it has to be thought about in a politically sophisticated way. And the second is that we have to avoid making the mistake now and in the future that we've made in the past of viewing Afghans as victims, as passive, as beneficiaries of aid and assistance, as opposed to stakeholders, partners, and actors. So thank you for that input. I turn now to Nilufar Saki.
Thank you. It's good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I would like to thank University of Notre Dame, Kroc Institute, and Keough School of Global Affairs for organizing this timely and important event and having me here among other distinguished panelists. Most of the very important point Ambassador already highlighted and set up a very concrete platform for what we're discussing today. I'm going to break down some of what already has been discussed there and my concern going forward with Afghanistan in the region, and what I think international community should actually do, since this is the theme of the conference today, in light of the threats that Afghanistan could pose, not only to the region, not only to itself, but to the global peace, and what international community should do. And is it a time to get more engaged or really be a passive passive engagement going forward? First of all, before talking about the factors that led us here, and also the consequences of the Taliban takeover, I think it's a time. It's imperative for the international community to get more engaged in Afghanistan than before, because it's not a threat to itself. Afghanistan does not pose threat to itself. Afghanistan poses threat to the global peace. And I'm gonna break down based on the research that I did, and I have, if anybody is interested for me to share this paper with you afterward, I'm happy to share that, because there's some data that I collected that highlights how these threats are serious for the global peace in terms of both traditional threats and non-traditional threats that Afghanistan can pose. And going forward, if not taken serious, I think the world has to go back to the region with more concrete plan, with more investment to be engaged. So let me start with that. Well, 20 years after 9/11 and the start of the global war on terror, Afghanistan continued to pose both traditional and non-traditional threats. While the purpose of the war in Afghanistan was to prevent the country from becoming a safe haven for Salafist terrorist group like Al-Qaeda, the recent Taliban takeover and return to power once again positioned the country to become a haven for Islamist organizations to re-emerge and reorganize. And as I mentioned, I have facts and data which highlights from at least last 2 months of their engagement with other groups. The Taliban takeover also creates conditions for large-scale socioeconomic crisis that will no doubt lead to frustration, aggression, and insurgency within Afghanistan that could lead to civil war within 3 to 5 years, according to the data, again, that I'm happy to share with people who are interested. So there are many reasons we should be concerned about the events unfolding in Afghanistan. 4 key factors can help us better understand what has contributed to and likely to increase the threats posed by and to Afghanistan. The first is the financial sources of terrorism. One imperative approach for dismantling transnational terrorist organization is the need to eradicate the financial sources. The counterterrorism strategies became moot when the financial sources are not dismantled. So some security scholars and researchers have gathered information highlighting that Taliban are critical to Al-Qaeda and have no operational relationship with Al-Qaeda. But again, there are a number of other reports since May of 2019, or if I'm not wrong, 2020, which says that Taliban never fully cut their ties with Al-Qaeda. And if the Taliban faces increasingly negative economic conditions in governing Afghanistan, they will most certainly look to further build a closer relationship with Al-Qaeda and other jihadist groups operating in the region. So this need-based relationship, which they have to turn to jihadist group for the money and financial sources, means that what it means for the Taliban, that they offer a heaven to Al-Qaeda in exchange for financial support. And other financial sources that they get from Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and there are reports that highlight those sources, along with the taxation system and illegal drug trade, all have helped to sustain the Taliban insurgency in the last 20 years. And there is a risk, again, that Taliban will actually revitalize those sources. So according to the report, the drug trade accounts for up to 60% of the Taliban's annual revenue. The Taliban have multiple ways of profiting from the drug trade, including attracting tribal chiefs with opium trade ties and supporting the transnational trade networks to receive contribution to strengthen their regime. So in partnership with Al-Qaeda during the Taliban regime from 1996 to 2001, Taliban and Al-Qaeda worked to move drugs out and money into Afghanistan, like other insurgent and extremist organizations operating along the Pakistan-Afghanistan border. So in the past, Taliban, in a nutshell, the Taliban utilized the drug money for their operational costs and now, instead of breaking up those drug networks, the Taliban are more likely to further strengthen them with economic gains and have an alternative way to sustain their regime. So that is one very direct transnational threat that they could pose to the world. The second is the inspiration for jihadists. There are reports highlights. So with the Taliban return to power, they have inspired jihadists, as ambassador also set a frame for that, to rally around their global mission to expand their territorial and ideological war. Pakistan, Bangladesh, there are reports from Tehrik-e-Taliban in Pakistan, there are reports from JMB, Jamaat-e-Mujahideen Bangladesh, which has clearly indicated that they like Taliban version of coming to power. And many other groups like in Somalia and many other countries in Africa as well. That there are reports which highlights that the jihadist group are looking at Taliban version of government and the way they came to power and getting inspired by it. On the other hand, the Taliban victory may inspire new groups and create a war of attrition in parts of countries like Tajikistan, the Central Asian countries, if you look at Tajikistan, that have a weak governance system, and where state operation seems to have provoked some violent incident in the past. So according to reports, violent extremism and insurgency exist in Tajikistan, and their root causes goes to Tajik state society relations, but that could easily unfold to violent Islamic extremism with a group like Taliban next door in power. So overall, this whole inspiration that emerged in the region among the jihadist group could be a trouble for the global peace, as I mentioned before. Now, talking internally in Afghanistan, a socioeconomic crisis. Afghanistan economy has been dependent on international aid, and according to World Bank report, 40% of its gross domestic product comes from international aid. So now, of course, that fund is still not going. That's an issue. And with the COVID, with the drought, and especially with the Taliban takeover, Taliban don't have manpower to govern, and Taliban have lack of capacity to govern Afghanistan. So there are so many other capability issues within the Taliban governance system that prevent them to govern the country going forward and to generate sources of income internally. That will lead another chaos in the sector of health, education, and overall create further humanitarian crisis. Now, with and the last one, the local grievances, which I think is an important one, and one has to look at this while recommending the support. The Taliban interim system or government lacks an inclusive policy to bring a diverse representation of people from different background, skill set, expertise, and ideology. Atrocities such as suppressing women's rights, detaining and beating journalists, warning protesters, imposing strict rules are some of the major and significant concerns that has been reported from more than 2 months of their takeover. The situation shadowed the lives of progressive men and women who cannot resume their daily routine, practice their values, or express their views freely and without fear. And the rights-based and intellectual communities have already started resisting the system or left the country. So there are 2 causes of these grievances. One, people believe that there are a large number is still waiting to leave the country. On the other hand, the pockets of resistance will create around the country, and that pockets of resistance will be utilized by the neighboring countries for their own interest. And that is where we are calling pockets of resistance might create opportunities for the regional countries to get more engaged and supporting some of those factors that might lead to civil war. I haven't calculated the time frame for that, but at least these are the factors that usually lead to civil war in other case studies around the world. So overall, there are the local and the regional factors, internal and external factors that allows further frustration, aggression, and disruption in Afghanistan, and that will end up and disrupting the global peace, as I mentioned. So now, what has to be done? I think Ambassador has highlighted an extremely concrete plan of action, which I would certainly echo what he has said. The only thing which I would like to add to his list is human-centric policy of engagement. Recognizing Taliban at this time would be a grave mistake. They will certainly demonstrate some of their good faces at this time, but I am not certain, at least we all, looking at their background and looking at the basis of their governance, which is based on their interpretation, particular interpretation that they have of the religion. So that premises give us, especially with the interim government that they recently put in place, that's I think a clear demonstration that they haven't changed at all. So therefore, supporting and, first of all, recognizing them would be a grave mistake. So the human-centric policy of engagement will be what Ambassador said, channeling the humanitarian program and project through the local setups, local NGOs, local non-state actors, supporting people inside. And we have been seeing that some of this funding are already allocated to the neighboring countries. I think that's not a good strategy going forward. The support should be on the local people, and the funds should be channeled inside Afghanistan, because most of it, again, goes to, we all have experience by the development funding, by the way. Most of it will go to the head cost of those organizations. It covered the head cost, it covered the administrative cost, and people will receive a very low portion of it. Therefore, the money should be channeled inside Afghanistan through local setups with a very less, I think if we talk logistically, with very less allocation to the admin cost or the head cost of those organizations who are allocating funding inside Afghanistan. By that, most of the money will go to the people who are in need. And just add to another what Ambassador said, is a regional platform. I have been advocating for this regional platform since October of 2018, when the so-called peace process started, and it never started. The regional platform doesn't mean ad hoc meetings with regional countries. The regional platform means a concrete plan of action, a unified action, which UN could lead, certainly. And that should go side by side with the other programs. Ambassador said, Bone 2, that could be one of that, but even Bone 2 would be an event. What I would envision to happen is really a consistent plan with all these regional countries meeting quarterly basis in order to address some of the issues and then respond with plan of action, some of the concerns or some of the issues that arise from the region and from Afghanistan to add, especially in terms of the issues arise from the issues of concern related to terrorism. That needs a lot of this regional consensus to happen and regional plan of action to go side by side other plan. I stop here, then I'm happy to answer any questions or answer you may have. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Niloufar. You know, one has a sense from the outside as a non-expert on Afghanistan, of course, of not only a situation of deep crisis, but of escalating crisis, and the potential for catastrophe, whether it's humanitarian or political or economic or security or all of those combined. And from a mediator's perspective, one of the questions that arises then is, what might Bond 2 look like? And what would be the incentives to get the Taliban there? So that's from a mediator's perspective, what's the strategy that would lead to or contribute to a viable peace process? So I'm planting an early question. I'm taking advantage of the fact that I have the mic before I call on Arif to take the floor.
Thank you so much, Professor. Thank you also to the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies, the Keough School of Global Affairs of Notre Dame for putting this event together and inviting us to speak. What I'll do is divide what I'm going to say in three categories. First, I want to make a few acknowledgements, and then I will talk about a couple of mind frames that we have been using, or that a certain mind frame that I will propose that we need to use as we engage with Afghanistan. And then lastly, I will propose a set of actions. First of all, I want to acknowledge that Afghans are suffering. And we need to remember that, and I emphasize that because whatever I say, I have my people in my mind. My family, my friends, my colleagues back in Afghanistan, and the general population, they are suffering. And those even who have left Afghanistan, who are in exile, are also suffering. Not only 97% of the Afghan population, after 20 years of international engagement, are left in poverty, but they are faced with hunger. They are faced with a widespread famine in the country. Their human rights are being violated. And these are not just abstract theories that we talk about here. These are concrete realities of my context. I was watching an episode of a conversation on TV last night. There is an analyst that I used to watch in the past who spoke with a lot of zeal, with a lot of passion. And there's also a Talib representative and a moderator. The moderator and the non-Talib, the analyst, you could tell they were shrinking. They were not speaking with a lot of confidence. They were speaking with a lot of fear. The correspondent posed the question to the analyst to ask him to respond to the Talib's comments. And he said, please do not ask me to face this man, because if I side with him, you will mock me. And if I oppose him, he will threaten me and I will no longer be here. And that was so disheartening for me to hear. And I want to acknowledge that. The second acknowledgement is that I want to thank the people of the United States and our partners in other places for standing up with us, particularly over the past 3 months. And I want to emphasize people, because non-government organizations, families, private citizens, they all stood up and they opened their homes and they started working in different channels and groups to provide help to Afghans. And I also acknowledge that there is a dilemma in how we deal with Afghanistan. It's not easy, it is complicated, because on the one hand, there are needs On the other hand, there's a regime that is very difficult to work with, that imposed itself, that won power through force, not legitimately through elections, but by force, by launching military campaign that was coordinated, that was against the warnings of the international community in the face of a peace process that was going on. The mind frames. I see a lot of conversations around events, and that's very important. There is a mind frame of an event-based conversation, an event-based engagement with Afghanistan. That's important, particularly when we have a plan in place and we want to implement that plan. In the implementation cycle, an event-based, which means that there is a short-term view, that it is driven by resources of what we have available or what we are willing to allocate, and that we prioritize certain things that we want to see change so that we can check boxes. It is important, but only in the implementation phase. What I would like to propose is a process-based engagement with Afghanistan. Whatever we do, even at the short term, has to be done within a long-term view and the broader context of the complexities of the situation. What we do has to be driven by the needs of people, not by the resources, because resources are subjective. We have to acknowledge that there's a multiplicity of needs and challenges in the country, not just one or two, so that we could put them in order and say, one, we do this, second, third, and fourth. It does not work that way. We should not be checking boxes, but show progress. What Afghans need right now is results. And so a process-based, a result-oriented engagement with Afghanistan is much needed right now. I have maybe about four specific set of actions that I would like to propose here. Number one, as proposed by His Excellency the Ambassador and fellow panelists, is the relief that is needed in the short term. And this will have a humanitarian nature, both inside Afghanistan and those who are in camps outside of Afghanistan. This has to deal with health, with food insecurity, with shelter, and the cold weather of the winter that's coming. But we must not weaponize aid at this time. The Taliban used to target our electricity poles, our supply chains, and humanitarian workers. We must not do that. We must not politicize aid. It has to be targeted, like my colleague said here, go directly to the people of Afghanistan, and aid has to be unconditional at this stage. Number two, we need to launch a process of policymaking, which I see is absent right now. In line with His Excellency the Ambassador's proposal, a conference of Afghans, those who are outside of Afghanistan and also inside of Afghanistan, is much needed. The Taliban has to see that Afghanistan is much greater than them. And in order to demonstrate that, we need to have a program that can bring all sides, all parties together. That will decide for the medium term and the long term situation of the country. Number three is that we need to activate diplomatic efforts to work for a political settlement. And I want to emphasize with a united stance from the international community, with leadership, strong leadership from the international community. This is not the first time, ladies and gentlemen, that a non-state actor has taken power in Afghanistan. This is not the first time that a government has collapsed in our country. Look at the 1970s. 2 times in the 70s, regimes changed by force. In the 90s, 2 times, regimes changed at least. And then in 2001, regime changed by non-state actors. And now again in 2021. So there is a cycle of violence that is going on. I want to emphasize that because we need to take a broader view, a longer-term view, so that we can address the problem in Afghanistan, not so that we can feed one family or two families, which is much needed right now, but that we can address the problem at its core. And so there's no evidence right now to see that another government will not collapse in the future. Number 4 is that we need to support civil society organizations, women groups, and political movements inside the country and abroad. This is really, really important because the alternative will be Daesh, Al-Qaeda, and other terrorist organizations taking power because they have a breeding ground. And what I'm proposing, particularly for the humanitarian part, there are also incentives for the Taliban. Ethically, fewer people will die under their governance. Politically, it can pave the way for engagement. And existentially, they also have families that will be benefited by this. I want to, again, emphasize what has been said. The international community must do these things not because it's ethical, not because they feel pity for Afghans, but because it's strategically the right thing to do right now. Threats from immigration, threats from insecurity and terrorism, all of those will be curbed if we approach the Afghanistan issue with a long-term view and with a package of issues. And finally, I have one recommendation to the Keough School of Global Affairs to turn this conversation into a series so we could build on it. Thank you so much.
Well, the last recommendation from Arif is the easiest one, and I'm happy to say yes. This is within our power, and yes, I think this is important. You know, we are averse at the Keough School and the Kroc Institute to simply doing one-off events. It's not good use of time and effort, and we really need to be engaged in a sustained and programmatic way. So this is our commitment to Afghanistan and to the people of Afghanistan, working with the panelists and others as partners to develop a program that is productive and in your interests. You know, a question that comes to mind, again, throwing out an early question from this side of the table, we talk about the international community as if it were an entity, and of course it's not an entity. The international community is an amalgamation of multilateral institutions, predominantly the UN and the EU, of member states, powerful states and donors, and important non-governmental multinational organizations. So the question that arises then is, when we talk about a Bond 2 or revival of Doha or a conference of Afghans, who takes the lead on all of this? Are we assuming that it's the UN, or is that not the right assumption? So if we're developing recommendations for action, to put them in the passive tense is not sufficient. We have to be clearer, sharper, I think, on who we're recommending take these initiatives. With that, I hand over to Rina. Look forward to hearing your remarks.
Thank you very much. I bear both the benefit and the burden of being the last speaker among a really excellent panel of speakers and friends, and agree with much of what has been said, particularly recognizing the strategic relevance of Afghanistan. We look at Afghanistan as a charity case, and it's misguided because Afghanistan was suffering 20 years ago, and well before 20 years ago, 30 years ago, the international community did not go to Afghanistan, and as Ambassador Isaaqzai said, did not go for women's rights. The US and the international community went into Afghanistan for strategic reasons, for security reasons, and those are as potent, if not more serious at this point. And it's just I think the approach to Afghanistan right now, I'm struck by the degree to which it's based on profound wishful thinking. Afghanistan is not an island unto itself. It's in a neighborhood of 4 nuclear weapons, incredibly fragile governments, and Afghanistan imploding does not mean that it's just going to go underground. It will bleed out into the region. It will arrive in Europe, as well as the US. I mean, look at history. We have to look at history to recognize that. And then I just want to talk about engagement with the Taliban. I feel that there's a great deal of righteousness right now in the international community in saying, well, we will not engage the Taliban. We will not in any way legitimize them. Well, for the last 2+ years, that is exactly what the international community did. And it was the international community, the US, the West, the region, engaged the Taliban for its own exit strategy. The US, the West, and the region continues to engage the Taliban for particularly the US and the West for the evacuations of its citizens. They all engage the Taliban for their bilateral security interests. Yet, when it comes to preventing the starving of the Afghan population, then suddenly there's this moral high ground that the international community places itself at. And I can say, as a woman, an Afghan woman, and as an activist who has worked on human rights and women's rights throughout my entire career, there is no moral high ground to starving the Afghan population. And the time right now is to approach this issue in the way that the international community approaches all of the issues that it views as relevant and critical, and that it is not an option, and that solutions have to be found to engage not on just a very narrow set of narrow definition of humanitarian support, which will be woefully insufficient. UNDP assesses that by next year, 97% of the population will be under the poverty line. Right now, 18 million people face gross food insecurity, and people are selling their children, not just their property, their children to get food on the table. I have 2 children, and I think of that at every single mealtime. And I think it's not just, this is about humanity. And so we have to think practically as well as principally. And we have tools. We have a whole range of tools right now. My colleagues have talked about a political settlement. As we all know, this government is untenable. It's unstable. And with lack of inclusivity, and when we should unpack inclusivity. By inclusivity, we mean the Taliban have taken that to mean they just add a few people from other ethnic groups, and that in itself will be sufficient. No, Afghan people know who their representatives are. They know who has credibility. They know who they have confidence in. They know who represents their communities. That is one critical component when it comes to inclusivity in terms of ethnic terms. Women and girls have always been the pathway to inclusivity in Afghanistan. When you exclude women and girls, you create radicalization and you create an extremist country. This is why extremists in every country, one of the things that they do is they exclude women and girls. Ideology, having an all-Talib government is not tenable. There's ideological diversity that has been accommodated for all of its flaws of the previous Islamic Republic. There was a whole spectrum that was represented in the government. And religion, the Taliban claim to represent all Muslims in Afghanistan, and they're very narrow and exclusive and odious interpretation of Islam, they take to be the only representation. In a country where we have different sects, we have different religions, and we certainly have diversity. Afghans are proud Muslims, but there's a diversity in terms of how Islam is practiced and Islam is viewed within Afghan society, and all of that has to be reflected. There's also the tool of human rights monitoring, which is sorry, let me go back in terms of, because you asked me to be specific in terms of political settlement. Well, we have mechanisms. For example, the UN UNAMA mandate is up for renewal, and right now they're supposed to be thinking and strategizing in terms of, it was rolled over, but there is going to be an opportunity to look at the UNAMA mandate. Well, the convening power, the good offices of the UN is going to be critical for that. Even right now, there's a special envoy position. The special envoy should be working at that fragmentation that exists within the UN Security Council between the Europeans and Russia and China, between the P2 and the P3. There should be engagement at the headquarters level. There should be, as the ambassador and Niloufar John have alluded, engagement with the region. It's absolutely critical. One of the dynamics that's changed overnight is now the region holds many of the cards rather than the West. The West holds money, which is fundamentally important, but there's an opportunity for engagement. I mean, the fact that the US was not at the most recent Moscow forum was, I think, a real missed opportunity. So these are opportunities both at the headquarter level as well as on the ground of what should be done. There is the human rights mechanisms. There was a missed opportunity again with the UN Human Rights Council where there's been a push to create monitoring mechanisms on the ground, and each time they've been thwarted primarily by Russia, China, and Pakistan. But I think we have to look at, the history in terms of human rights monitoring. UNAMA has actually been this has been one of the strongest components. And it's not just, we talk about protection of women and girls. There's other interests which would also be of interest, for example, to the Taliban. ISK violations, which they're interested in looking at. There's an opening, a window in which we could look at in terms of pushing forward more proactive human rights monitoring. There's a special rapporteur that has been appointed and will take her or his position in March. There's an opportunity to do a lot of work with that. There is the UN sanctions monitoring mechanism. And this would actually be really important to bolster and to strengthen, to encourage greater de-risking behavior on the part of humanitarian organizations, on the part of funding organizations. And it would also enable some vigilance so that funds aren't siphoned off and provided to taken by the Taliban. There's an opportunity for new thinking. It's been calamitous, but there's an opportunity for the international community where enormous mistakes have been made. And I know that there's a lot of looking backward, but it should be a looking backward to look ahead. And part of that is, for example, we have all talked about the fact that Afghans have not been at the table. There's been so much lip service to Afghan-led and Afghan-owned. It was never Afghan-led and Afghan-owned. And there's an opportunity for that, both of the recent arrivals of Afghans who represent some of the best and the brightest of Afghanistan, who can actually sit down with the humanitarian, with the UN at headquarters, with governments, with USAID, with humanitarian agencies, and guide them. These are the people that are still talking to large swaths of the population inside the country, and they know what's going on, and they know also how some of this was done in the 1990s, how the country has changed, how this can all be modified. The West does not have to figure this out on its own. And then inside the country, much of the country was left out of many of the programs that were rolled out. It was a very Kabul-centric approach. Now there's an opportunity to really work also at the subnational level, and to really be dynamic in the way that we approach this work. But as we do it, we should do it with coherence and coordination. There's a temptation on the part of international organizations still, particularly humanitarian agencies, to brokered separate deals with the Taliban so they get more access. There's a danger of the seduction of being the Taliban whisperer. The Taliban will gain beyond any other entity, and it's the Afghan population that will suffer. So we need coherence, coordination. I think the UN, again, UNAMA can play a very important role in that regard. So both in terms of UN agencies, in terms of the humanitarian organizations, but also of the region and the West coming together pragmatically to identify a common set of denominators which can provide them leverage and prevent further destabilization of Afghanistan that would be calamitous on so many levels. Thank you.
I open up the conversation now to questions and comments from the audience. We are running over time, so I'm going to compromise a little bit on the time allocated to the session. Our speakers will not respond immediately, so we'll just gather comments and questions and then do a final wrap-up by the speakers. If you want to speak, you're welcome to come up here, in which case you're going to be seen for the live screening audience. The camera's over here. Or if you wish to remain seated, we will get a mic to you. So
I'm loud.
All right.
Speak from here. Thank you very much. My wife is this webinar audience can't hear you. Get them up. Thank you so much for this event. Timur Karimi from Bamiyan Foundation. My wife is Notre Dame alum, so go Irish. And thank you, the panelist members, for this insightful discussion. One thing. For the past 20 years, I've been attending events in DC, and it's wonderful to see more Afghans represented here. But what I don't see is at the intra-Afghan level, Hazaras in this panel, members of my ethnic group, who are systematically targeted on the basis of ethnicity and religion. This month alone, in October, in Kunduz, 150 killed, 200 injured, men, women, children. In Kandahar, another 62 killed, 90 injured. These numbers we were, getting increased daily. My apologies if I'm getting a little emotional here, but there was an absence of discussion of the ethnic dynamics in Afghanistan, and that's been missing for the past 20 years. And as Hazara, it's frustrating for us that whenever these type of events happen, we are missing. We are paying the highest cost in Afghanistan at the moment. We are systematically being targeted. The way we look, we're easily distinguishable in Afghanistan. U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum came out and issued a statement. Amnesty, human rights, all of them, that our people, Hazaras, we're on the verge of a genocide. And also, there's a misnomer that these Taliban are from neighboring countries, from Mars, from wherever. No, most of them are homegrown. Let's own it. It's on both sides of the Duran line. Mass displacement, land grab. I mean, in Daikundi, tens of thousands are displaced. The ambassador was kind to mention the Hazaras briefly, but what most of my Pashtun compatriots do is as soon as they mention Hazara, there's a guilt by association to Iran. As soon as he mentioned Hazaras, there was an association with Iran that it's basically gaslighting the victims. This is a strategy used by our Pashtun compatriots for years. As soon as there's a mention of Hazara at stages like this, we're silenced. Association by Iran, you're inviting attack on yourselves. Come on. I mean, if we want to come to a true unity, this is not the way to go. My apologies for being a bit emotional, but it is emotional. Our families, our kids, our women, our children. 8 kids in west of Kabul died of hunger couple of days ago in Hazara enclave. The systematic discrimination against Hazaras is not new. It's been ongoing since the founding of the modern state of Afghanistan. Afghanistan was founded in the 1890s by Abdurrahman upon genocide of Hazaras. 60% of Hazara population were wiped out. And this was part Afghanization of Afghanistan. And systematic discrimination, marginalization have continued ever since. And Taliban is just one chapter. And what I urge entities, think tanks, government, for inclusion of Hazaras so that our voices are heard. It's very frustrating in light of what's going on. And I mean, again, thank you for the insightful discussion. I'm really happy that women are here represented, women of Afghanistan, but Hazara women, the voice of Hazaras must be heard. I'm fearful. There is a sense of fear and anxiety among members of my community. Everyone that we talk to, they are afraid of a genocide. Genocide. All the hallmarks are there. All the red flags are there. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I say I really do appreciate your comments. I appreciate your highlighting the issue which, as the organizers, we have inadvertently neglected. And I think your comments at least partly address the problem of exclusion. And it's something that we will be attentive to, and no doubt the panelists will respond. So thank you for the comments and thank you for the passion. Yes, my colleague in the front here. Oh, okay,
It's okay.
Sorry.
Salam, hello. Thank you for the great discussion. I really appreciate that, and thank you for Keough School of Global Affairs for putting such a great discussion. I'm Malala Habibi, Keough School alumni, and currently I'm working with International Civil Society Action Network, focusing on women, peace, and security. There are stories every day about Afghan selling or marrying off their daughters to the Taliban because of the poverty. Blocking humanitarian aid, as some mistakenly suggest, won't put pressure on the Taliban, but the very people on the ground will pay the price, especially women and girls. And we just heard about 8 kids starved to death because of lack of access to the food. What condition, rather than leveraging humanitarian aid, do you think would work the best so that the Taliban abide by the human rights and humanitarian laws, and also to agree to come and sit in Doha or elsewhere, as Mr. Ambassador suggests, and discuss the needs and wants of the people? What do we have to leverage? What do we have to make the recognition of them conditional? Thank you.
Great. Halali, thank you. Great question. Questions of leverage in these kind of situations are always critical. And we don't assume when the word leverage comes up that we mean bashing people over the head. Leverage is complex and can be subtle and ranges from soft leverage to hard leverage, and often it's a combination that would be most appropriate. So there are also hands in the front, but I'll leave it to you, Maura.
Yeah, thank you. If I'll be authorized, I would like to step up behind the podium for 2 minutes, please, if you guys would be comfortable with that. Yes. All right. Good evening, everyone. My name is Hidari. I'm representing the World Hazara Council here today, but my engagement with the U.S. government have been as a defense contractor in Afghanistan from late 2004 until 2015. From 2015 and now, I live in the United States as an SIV recipient. Behind this podium, the reason I stood up is I would like to echo the voices of my community members. I totally concur with Timur Karimi about the absence and isolation of the Hazaras. Especially, we are one of the main ethnic religious group of Afghanistan. We have been under extreme pressure and facing atrocities in Afghanistan from centuries ago. And coming to the aid provision of Afghanistan again, my suggestion is, or my question is from the respected speakers. If you would like to request the international community to authorize or start provisioning of aid packages to Afghanistan, how you would recommend the aid packages should be delivered to the Afghan public? Have you rather thought that the aid packages would be reaching out to the hands of those needy and poor families? Or you suggest the aid packages should flow through or be channelized through the Taliban's regime? If you're thinking the aid should be going through the Taliban, I think we are again doing the same mistake or committing the mistake such as the coin strategy when we were fighting against in counterinsurgency. We were flowing with the coin strategy, we were flowing or throwing tons of money every day in those areas that the insurgents were actively making them equipped. During the daytime, they were receiving the money, and during the nighttime, they were buying artillery and killing the American and Western soldiers, and as well as the Afghan people. We have to be careful on that. If the aid packages have to be delivered to the Afghan public, it has to be properly channelized, it has to be properly delivered. The problem of isolation, discrimination, and negligence should be properly addressed. The second, beside that, even I still wanted to echo the voice of Timur Karimi with Mr. Ambassador. Please, anytime you talk about the internal crisis in Afghanistan, do not engage the Hazaras to Iran. I would like to say that, as we all agree today, the majority of the Taliban, I would say 99% of them are the Pashtuns, but we do not echo that to the Pashtun ethnicity or tribe. Please, do not echo Hazaras being on side of Iran. I, being a Hazara, I stood strong. I prevented the death, the celebration of the Iran supreme leader in Kabul. I prevented Iranian regime, did not let them open their consulate in Bamyan in 2006 and 2007. And I'm a defense contractor. I have been properly vetted, and I am a Hazara. Thank you very much.
Kevin, thank you for those remarks. Yeah, a colleague in the front. No, we're going to do a wrap-up at the end. Otherwise, we're going to run too late.
Yes, hello, I'm Bill Goodfellow. There's a lesson from Vietnam, I think, that's relevant here. In 1975, I came back from Vietnam. I was evacuated from Cambodia and Saigon, and I set up an organization to try to lobby for engagement with Vietnam. The international community completely turned its back on Vietnam. We kept a trade embargo for 19 years. We waited 20 years to normalize relations. The situation was grim. They were tough commies. They were putting hundreds of thousands of people into camps. In 1995, we normalized relations. Anybody that goes to Vietnam today can see the fruits of this normalization. It's dramatically changed. There's still communists. There's still no real freedom of religion or press. But it's just dramatically improved. So engagement works, it helps. And the policy should be driven by concern for Afghans, not vindictiveness. America was bitter after Vietnam, and there's a bitterness now with Afghanistan. I just feel that there's some lessons in Vietnam. Engagement works, commerce works. I realize that I share the concerns that everybody here has about the Taliban. But we weren't very enthusiastic about the Vietnamese in 1975. But engagement is important. We should not wait 20 years to engage.
Good. Bill, thank you. Reminding us of lessons from history. We also have two women more behind Bill there.
Thank you so much. Yeah, sure. This is Tahmina Sabat. I'm an alumni of Notre Dame's Law School and currently a Fulbright Scholar at Minnesota State University. Today, I just want to talk without censorship straight. We know that Afghan people are kind of past this stage of requesting the non-recognition of the Taliban's government from the international community, because we all know that China, Pakistan, Russia, Iran, they are already talking about recognizing this new regime, whatever it is. So I just want to ask specifically the ambassador, that what do you think, besides all of this speech or the requests that we are making about the conditioned recognition from the UN state actors, what else can be done in action to request the conditioned recognition of the Taliban's regime, specifically to ask them to respect human rights, respect international law, and respect the women's rights?
Great.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, everybody. I'm Ruqya Samim. I'm currently a student of Notre Dame. My question is kind of related to Tahmina's question. Like, now millions of lives of Afghans are dependent on what international community will do about Taliban government or Taliban regime in Afghanistan. So we are talking that how do you think that United Nations or other international NGOs can should react to this issue in Afghanistan, or how they can work with the Taliban without recognizing them, and if they recognize this government as a legitimate government, so what will happen to Afghans people? Like how can they help millions of Afghans to save their futures? How they can protect women for not being sacrificed again? So now we know that no girl has the right to go to the school, even primary school. Like female teachers are not paid, and people are suffering from poverty and hunger, and journalists, civil activists are being killed and beaten in the public because of raising their voice. So how the international community will react to all of this by not recognizing them, and if they recognize them, so what will happen to all of this? And also one more thing that you mentioned about UNAMA. So UNAMA's mandate will change. Yeah, so the previous mandate was to support Afghanistan government in providing good offices and supporting the elections, peace process, monitoring and protection of human rights, gender equality. So what do you think, what their new mandate will be in Afghanistan now in current situation? And also, again, this question comes up that how they can work with Taliban without recognizing them, so how they will be able to do this. Thank you so much.
So thank you to our Notre Dame students for challenging, complicated questions. Thank you. I'm only going to take two more comments and then I will hand over to the panelists. So I have two colleagues in the back.
Hi, my name is Allison Spencer and I'm with Afghan Assistance Group. Many Afghan advocates have been receiving pleas for help obtaining humanitarian aid, and we've been sending them to the World Food Program. But we've been told by these Afghans that the World Food Program is demanding that those at risk register with their district elders, who are then turning over that information to the Taliban. And these people are in hiding, afraid for their lives, and our people are telling us that they would rather starve to death than to have their information turned over to the Taliban and be tortured and killed. What can be done to address this? And because something really needs to change for these people. The need of food shouldn't be a death sentence, and that's what it currently is for many people. That's one of the reasons why a 2-year-old, and that is one of my partners who's been working with this family and has known this family for over a year, passed away last week from starvation. We need better solutions to what we're currently doing. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Rose Lozon. I'm with the Afghan Assistance Group, and I primarily am dealing with evacuation and safer while in hiding. But my question is, what are the circumstances that are allowing women to flourish in their businesses? Is it regional or is it local negotiation with the Taliban? Because we're not going to be able to evacuate everybody, and the nature of high-value targets, will they be able to reintegrate into society, or is this going to be a long-term hiding situation? Thank you.
Great, thank you. These are really challenging, important, and complicated comments and questions that we have. And I don't want us to feel too much pressure of time, given the importance of the issues, but there is some pressure of time. So I'm going to invite the panelists in the order in which they spoke to respond. The panelists can choose which of the comments. We don't expect you to address everything. So we would really invite the panelists to respond to one or two of the issues, questions, or concerns that they deem most important, starting with Ambassador Ghulam.
Thank you. very good question, and I'm not sure we have a lot of time to answer them, so I'll just pick on a few of them, and I'm sure my co-panelists can also touch upon them. I just wanted to first, I think I heard our brother Karimi and also our brother Hidari for really talking about the exclusion of Hazaras from these events and also the fact that we haven't really spoken about the ethnic dimension of Afghanistan conflict. I appreciate what you're saying, but I also wanted to clarify the link with Iran. I certainly agree with you that we should not, under any circumstances, associate our ethnicity with a particular group, because that is really dangerous and risky. What I was referring to is that should Afghanistan descend into chaos, we gave opportunities for these countries to use a particular ethnic group as proxies. Perhaps I didn't talk about Tajikistan or Pakistan for the same reason, who are using the Pashtuns as proxies. So I think we're all victims. And I would be also very careful not to single out ethnicity as the basis of our discussion, because I think we have to speak of the whole of Afghanistan. I think every community has been victimized. I mean, we have to look at how many Pashtuns have lost their lives during this 20 years of Taliban's offensives. So for me, Hazaras are as important as any other nationality. I do appreciate, and I also very much agree, that they have been deliberately targeted many, many times by ISIS and by other groups. And that is something we have to, I think, is precisely what our enemies are trying to do to really sow the discord among the various ethnic groups in Afghanistan. And I really salute the Hazaras not to falling into that trap. So my association to Iran is not certainly that that Hazaras are associated. I think you're as much a part of our Afghanistan community as any other. But also, let's look at the past. I mean, I've been following Afghanistan events, and I'm sure you do, that in the 80s, how our ethnicities were divided among countries. You had the 8 parties that were supported by Iran, and then the other 7 Mujahideen parties that were supported by Pakistan, and I think that's so. I do agree that we should try to be representative in these events and make sure that we do justice. The other thing I wanted to focus on, I think it was so much on the issue of recognition. The recognition is a very complex issue. I didn't want to go into it because I work with it in the UN. Now, there is bilateral recognition. That's very much the sovereign rights of countries to have diplomatic relationship with state or non-state. Well, at this point, I think there are, again, 2 levels of that. There are state-to-state recognition, which the Nordic countries or Europeans very much, they don't recognize a particular government, but they recognize a country as a state. But then there are countries that recognize a particular government or regime. So I think this issue is going to keep coming up in the discourse on Afghanistan for many years or months to come, and it will not be very clear unless some country come out and say, we do recognize the Taliban government, like was what happened in the 90s with Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and UAE, actually, specifically. But in others, there could be other symbolic actions or symbolic way of expressing that recognition by exchange of the ambassadors. Now, EU recently announced that they will reopen their office. Now, that does not mean recognition. They probably opened that, or I'm not here to speak for you, but from my understanding is that they want to engage with the Taliban, but that does not necessarily mean recognition. And again, we have to separate the issue of recognition from engagement. I think we're all in favor of engaging with the Taliban, but I think nobody wants that to impart recognition. And the reason for engagement I outlined also in my statement is that we're dealing with issues of terrorism, humanitarian activities, and development, collapse of economy, and a host of other things. You have a group now that's in charge of a territory, that's in charge of a people. So I think there has to be some form of engagement, but again, that has to be very much. looked at. And then the multilateral recognition is where the UN seat is. Now, that will be determined in November by the UN Credential Committee as to who is the rightful owner of that seat. Now, the charter, again, the various UN policies and principles really drive that recognition issue. It's not as easy as that you're in control of a territory that you would automatically be holding that seat. So the Taliban really have to earn that seat. And earning that seat means respecting and abiding by the international commitments and principle and exhibiting the spirit and letter of the charter, which undoubtedly and explicitly talks about women's rights and human rights. So I think that there is a long way to go for the Taliban. Now, I also wanted to say a few words about aid and humanitarian support and how it can be delivered. Here, I want to make it very clear again, because I'm a former UN development and humanitarian activist myself, is that humanitarian aid should not be politicized and should not be linked to recognition or other. I think my fellow panelists mentioned that it has to be unconditional, because here we're talking about saving lives. And when you want to save lives, you do not want to link it to other conditions. So we need to separate humanitarian aid totally from development aid, which I think some of the UN agencies are engaged in. And here, I think we have mechanism. Again, my colleagues here also talked about working directly. There are hundreds of NGOs and civil society organizations operating in Afghanistan. There is the United Nations, which is, the question is not so much delivering aid, the question is that there is not enough money to meet the demands right now. You have 18 million people, but it is, every day we're adding more people. More people are added to this group. So it's not just 18 million anymore. It could be, 20, and I guess by winter it must be maybe the whole of Afghanistan, because the whole economy is in a state of shock and nothing is working. So we really need to find mechanism and there are mechanisms. I have worked in the UN long enough to establish the UN is very creative in that. And finally, on the issue of peace process, Bond 2, I wanted to, I think Niloufar Jan also mentioned that, and also my colleague Dostiar, is that indeed it shouldn't be an event-based. It shouldn't be an event-based mechanism. What I meant by Bond 2 is where we could come together to establish a process. Right now, there's no alternative to Taliban. Everybody's talking to the Taliban. Well, there are millions of Afghans in diaspora. There are remnants of the government that I represent. And there are a lot of others who wants to be involved and engaged. How do we pull all of this together and turn it into a platform, an alternative voice to counter Taliban's narrative and Taliban? So I think there is right now no process. There is no process. It's very fragmented. Russia is having its own conference. Iran is having now one, and India is announcing one, and so on and so forth. So I think what I meant is that we need to really agree on a process that we reach permanent peace. Because if we don't do that, I think we've learned enough lessons from history in Afghanistan that these things are going to fail, these events and things. And so I think it is important for us to go in that direction. So let me stop here and allow other colleagues to fill in the gaps.
Ambassador, thank you very much. I see Rina's needing to dash to catch a train or a plane. If you want to make your quick remarks before leaving.
Yes, sure. Thank you very much. And apologies to everyone for having to leave early. But I do want to recognize the comments from our compatriots from Hazara. I think it is really important. Because of many factors. One, as you noted, Hazaras are a distinguishable other. I think that's the problem. Everyone is under threat right now, but Hazaras can be singled out and are being singled out, particularly by ISK, for example, in the last several years has been targeting Hazaras to inflame ethnic tensions. Hazaras are also being targeted because in the last 2 decades, Hazaras have really been very effective in getting into the education sector and doing really well. And there's some level of, I think, some level of animosity because of the success that Hazaras have had. And while I absolutely agree that we should be very dangerous of not succumbing to the pull of ethnic fragmentation, I do think that there are vulnerable groups, Hazaras, the very small Hindu and Sikh community that every day is shrinking. We do have ethnic groups that are more vulnerable, and I do think that the ethnic groups that have a larger representation should be advocating and really upholding the protection of the more vulnerable communities. And I do agree that it's important in these panels to make sure that representation is there. So I think that there was a shortcoming in terms of our analysis to not highlight that, particularly because of the targeting that we are all aware of that's been taking place in other countries. So on my part, I apologize for my shortcoming in that regard. In terms of the UNAMA mandate, it's very difficult to say, that's right now there are many different groups that are trying to, deliberating, including the UN, because yes, the UN was an assistance mission, and clearly it cannot be an assistance mission to a government to a de facto government that's not recognized. But the UN works with all actors, and that's one of the, has the convening power. And in the 1990s, if you go back to the days of UNSMA played a really key role in engaging the Taliban, as well as actors across the political spectrum. And I do very much hope that, the question right now is, will UNAMA focus? It has 3 key components that it works on, with human rights, the humanitarian, and the political. And some are advocating that it should just be humanitarian with human rights. I would really make the strong appeal that we need all elements, because you do need political dialogue with the Taliban, and you need the UN to step in and engage in trying to forge a political settlement of the type that my colleagues have spoken to. I don't want to keep this longer, so I thank you for an excellent discussion. And again, I really do thank you for bringing Afghan voices, and I'm glad that you came to the podium to address the gap in our representation. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Rina. So I invite the Muniza, and then we'll do Nilufar and Arif for brief closing remarks. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So with the question on how aid packages to be channeled, I think there are many NGOs and as well as the private sector in Afghanistan that can be used to channel aid packages. And with today's technology, life is very easy to monitor. And so I do not understand why our international partners, again, this is a question of why our international partners are not making that effort to really deliver the aid packages through these smaller NGOs that can reach out to the grassroots and can reach out to the streets and people, to every village in Afghanistan. And as I said, monitoring with today's technology is easy, and we don't have to worry about whether it will reach people or not. It will reach people if we use technology. And then on the women's businesses, yes, our engagement is because of that, because of integrating them back and helping them to resume operation, and not only sell within Afghanistan as they were doing it, especially many of them have had just women clients because of the type of the businesses that they were running, but also outside. We are working on an online platform where we would like to enable their online sales throughout the world. And with that, I'd like to also mention that women, that again, on the international partners side, that international partners side, by not sending women to these meetings with Taliban, they're undermining women's position, and they're disempowering us. So that would be my last ask from our international partners to please not send only men to these meetings in Qatar or in Kabul. Send your women to meet Taliban and highlight the need for women's presence in the tables. Thank you.
Great. I like that. Thank you. Niloufar.
Yeah, I think most of the questions are addressed. I wanted to talk about what practical step can UN do in order to monitor the human rights violation. Human Rights Watch committees, usually in certain other cases around the world, has been very helpful in the under authoritative system to gather information or report to the UN, and then it's just like a shadow reporting that some countries provide to the UN. I think the committee, if it's established under the UN, the Human Rights Watch Committee that some other countries have, to monitor the violations and then report to the headquarters, and then based on that, UN engagement with the Taliban should be determined. That's one of the practical, pragmatic mechanism to go on. In relation to the aid, accessibility of the aid, there are community centers around the country. I don't know, some of us who work in the development sector, we know that the last 20 years have put in place the community centers in every village and districts of Afghanistan. So we have around 5 to 6 community centers in the districts of 1,000 to 2,000 people. And those community centers are the head of the communities, elders, leaders of the community, and religious leaders as well. So I think that is that could be used as a platform to channel aid directly to the community. And when we are talking about humanitarian aid, we mean food, shelter, the basic necessities. It's not about development, it's about the basic necessities. So those community centers, I think, could be targeted if the international community wants the aid to be accessible to the larger population, especially who are in need. The issue regarding the legitimacy of the Taliban, I think Taliban should gain legitimacy inside Afghanistan first. And that's important. I mean, they should put, the recognition has a cost. And that cost, and there are all means of recognition, as Ambassador highlighted, but at least initially at this particular stage, they are not legitimized because they took the power by force. So there are, by the way, ideas which is coming forth since last 2 months, elections. Right, that's one thing that has been put. Some of the practitioners who have worked under such a context, they are actually proposing why not election to see how legitimate Taliban government is, or how supportive people are of the Taliban, because Taliban do claim that we won. That the claim of the Taliban is that they won by the power of people. That's how they claim, but that is a wrong claim. They won by force, by violence, and we have actually the report, the zigzag of the violence, the surge of violence from last 2.5 years indicates that they won by force through violence. So I think that should be tested inside, and to gain the legitimacy, they have to have a governance system in place. They have to respect the rights of minorities and the women, and they have to be inclusive in their approach if they want a system to be in place. And they have to feed people, right? They have to feed the population and address the basic needs of the population in large, which are right now starving. So these are some fundamental steps that has to be monitored going forward, monitored internationally, if Taliban are really able to do all this, because the first and foremost responsibility of a state is to protect the population. And if the state is not able to, or if the government is not able to protect the population, why they should be recognized? So that is this. I think this condition should be seen, should be followed, and should be monitored closely in terms of any kind of legitimacy which has to be given to the Taliban going forward. But again, I said at this stage it would be a mistake giving any kind of recognition to the Taliban, looking at their record from last 2 months at least. Thank you.
Good, thank you. Then a really important distinction that's been made throughout between engagement on the one hand and recognition on the other, to see them as separate categories. Arif, and then I'm going to invite Salim to do the closing and the thanks.
Well, thank you so much. I will be brief. First of all, I want to also acknowledge and echo what Hidari Saab and Timuri Saab shared. Thank you so much for for coming out and speaking on that. I want to emphasize that Hazaras have unfortunately been singled out, have been deliberately targeted in different parts of Afghanistan, and that we need to acknowledge that. And that we are one nation, and everybody has the right to live in Afghanistan and be from that country. Another quick comment on the issue of women. Unfortunately, the situation is dire and difficult on all Afghans, on women particularly. It is very difficult. I would just say that we need to engage more women, and we need to support, as I said in my recommendation number 4, is supporting different groups. There are 4 or 5 distinct groups that I have listed. Women are in all of them, but also their own category that need to be supported and their voices amplified. We need to give the podium because they do have a voice. And women of Afghanistan are already challenging the dominant thinking about women among men or men majority groups. They are the bravest people right now on our streets in Afghanistan. And so, and that they will, I believe, make their way and find their way and gain what it is that they want, because they already have a voice and they are working hard. But they do need to be supported and their voices amplified here and around the world. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Arab. Salem.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nathan, University of Notre Dame, the Keough School, drop my mask, and the Keough Institute for hosting this incredible, engaging and forthright and transparent discussion. A big thank you to all of our participants today who joined us. In an All Afghan Voices panel, I strongly believe that the speakers today brought forward challenges, constraints, and opportunities that lay ahead of the international community in helping the people of Afghanistan and engaging the current rulers of Afghanistan. More importantly, I believe that our panelists very, very strongly made the case and highlighted the significant risks associated with disengagement and the catastrophic consequences it could have, not only for Afghanistan, but for the nations around the world. We referred to disengagement consequences in the context of history, but I believe 20 or 30 years is a very short time for history. And we've seen that back to begin with in the 1990s when the US first disengaged. And by that, the whole world. And then, of course, on engaging, I think there was a very good distinction made between recognition and engagement. And in terms of engagement, I think we have to be talking about it in the past tense. The international community, particularly the US, has been engaging the Taliban. It started in 2019. So it's as somebody in the private sector, it sometimes confuses me when we encourage the US government to engage. Really? They are engaged. They're working with them. They're meeting them every single day. And so when it comes to humanitarian assistance and development aid, Rina Amiri is not here, but why are we weaponizing it? So that I think is a very important, parting thought for all of us here and also for our viewers online. Then the other question was also very important in terms of how do we do it. Let me just tell you that it is happening in Afghanistan. People are working in Afghanistan. We are working in Afghanistan. There are brave women and men today in NGOs, companies, civil society organizations that are fighting every single day. All we need to do is to talk to them and support them. So it's not like we're going back to square one. There is action, and it's happening every day. And so my request and support to everyone here and who's watching this is to reach out to any organization that you know and try to advocate on behalf of them. They are our last hope currently in Afghanistan. Leaving them alone, I think, is going to have dire consequences for all of us. Then I also wanted to talk a little bit, very briefly, just one line about the self-imposed censorship. There are things that are currently happening in Afghanistan which aren't pleasant, but there are also things that are some sort of hope, and that is, you continue working unless somebody stops you. So we work in Afghanistan. Nobody has closed down our offices. Our female colleagues are reporting to work every day. And so rather than going into a self-imposed censorship of saying, they might close us, which might be the reality, sorry, it is the reality for a lot of our friends and allies back then. But when there is that glimpse of hope, let's support that and let's help people who have decided to stay and to work. And then again, just as a kind of a last note and also last thought to leave you with is there was 20 years of investment in Afghanistan, and not everything was a failure. We've had some great successes, and I think this panel today, most of it is the evidence. This is the generation of the last 22, 23 years that has happened. I think the more higher costs will be if we let those small voices that are currently active in Afghanistan to just move away. And the costs of rebuilding everything is going to be much, much greater. Thank you so much, and wish you all the best. Thanks.
This concludes the live streamed portion of our gathering today. Thank you for those of you who stayed with us, despite us going over time. But of course, it was quite worth it, given all the tremendous contributions to this conversation. So signing off from Washington, D.C., to our live stream audience, thank you for joining us.